Only 14 days earlier here in San Francisco, the press had announced to the world the marriage of the Yankee Clipper to the star of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. He was Joe DiMaggio, the best-known baseball player of his generation. And his bride was none other than the voluptuous Marilyn Monroe. Always on the lookout for the latest scoop, the press people had spread the rumor that today, January 24, 1954, the couple was leaving on their honeymoon for Japan. Japan? It's the middle of winter in Japan. World War II ended there only 9 years ago. Strange choice for a honeymoon. Let's go back and look at a couple other oddities. The send-off doesn't seem to have attracted much of a crowd for Hollywood's hottest couple. And who's the guy in the hat, waving to the crowd along with DiMaggio and Monroe? Former player and coach Lefty O'Doul, DiMaggio's friend and colleague. So let's start this all over again, shall we? Because contrary to what the press announced, Joltin' Joe DiMaggio and his new bride Marilyn Monroe are not taking off on their honeymoon. Hardly. DiMaggio was going to Japan because he signed a contract to run a series of baseball clinics with O'Doul. Marilyn simply accompanying her new husband. Joe thinks she should get out of town for a while anyway, embroiled as she is in a serious contract dispute with her studio, 20th Century Fox. Joe ignored the honeymoon spin as just more of the same old Hollywood nonsense he couldn't stomach anyway. How little he knew where having his wife along would lead. After 2 long days of air travel, with a layover in Honolulu, their arrival in Tokyo on the night of February 1st touched off a veritable panic. DiMaggio was already very well known in Japan, an American superstar who'd already run clinics and done some coaching there. When the press announced he was coming for his honeymoon with none other than America's #1 sex symbol, not only were his fans excited, but her fans were beside themselves. For the Japanese press, the real scoop has little to do with Joltin' Joe and everything to do with Marilyn. The pressing crowd of photographers and the reporters' incessant questions so bothers DiMaggio that he brought the first press event in Tokyo to a rather, well, abrupt conclusion. Now, of course, these images provoked gossip columnists all over the world. Here, for example, is the way their arrival in Tokyo was reported in thousands of cinemas across America.
When a well-known honeymoon couple arrives at Tokyo airport, a throng of 4,000 baseball and movie fans surge out of control, break through police lines. Joe DiMaggio and his bride smile bravely at their greeters, but they don't dare move. So back into the plane they go, while police clear a path to the cargo hatch with DiMaggio's convertible. The stratagem works. The former Yankee slugger and his picture bride escape into the car and head for the safety of their hotel. But their troubles aren't over. Next day comes a press conference where the public was barred, but the photographers and reporters more than made up for that. Their questions were rough, ranging from the risque to the ridiculous. And Joe, he's the forgotten man, which is something in Japan where baseball is so popular. Never underestimate the power of you-know-who. But enough's enough. His patience is exhausted, and Joe says, go.
4 days later, Monroe visits the American Military Hospital in Tokyo. She had time on her hands and wasn't much interested in her husband's baseball. The newsreels were still spinning the honeymoon lead, and few viewers even knew what Joe was up to. But the cameras show Marilyn alone. But what were these GIs doing in Japan? 9 years after World War II, America was still very present in Japan. For the past 3, the country had served as a holding base for the war in Korea. Today, combat had ended, but 120,000 GIs were staying put. This was the very first time that Marilyn Monroe had visited with American military personnel. But many other entertainers had given their time. It had become something of an American tradition since, well, 1918. And the very first time it was filmed, here on Pennsylvania Avenue, just 2 blocks from the White House. World War I was costing America a fortune, and Hollywood's greatest stars were solicited to collect money for the war effort. Mary Pickford, Hollywood's greatest movie star, responded to the call. and came to the nation's capital with two friends, Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin. That's Charlie Chaplin there. Mary Pickford addresses the crowd come to see her, while at the same time paying attention to the cameraman, whose images we're watching, to make sure he can shoot her in optimal conditions, practically straight on. The poor news photographer, who we see behind her, is a bit dejected, to say the least. Movie cameras have the upper hand as early as 1918, and still photographers like this one are simply out of luck. Mary Pickford, like the dancing Charlie Chaplin, already understood the camera's importance. This footage was seen across the U.S., and a considerable sum was raised for the war effort, and the day in D.C. marked the beginning of a long association between Hollywood and the American military. 36 years later, supporting the armed forces was already a Hollywood habit, and the cameras were always there to film that support, provided the footage cleared the military censors. Marilyn Monroe doesn't hesitate to shake black soldiers' hands or to chat with them. Although segregation was officially abolished in the military in 1954, racism still pervaded American society. For many Americans, images of Marilyn Monroe and wounded black GIs in Tokyo were provocative, too provocative to do anything but put them aside as unused rushes. But wait, let's look again at what was used, more slowly. Because the bandaged thumb on Marilyn's right hand, revealed in other footage shot that day, did capture editors' attention. Columnists evoke some terrible argument with DiMaggio during the so-called honeymoon. But in fact, Monroe's thumb was already bandaged before they arrived in Tokyo, when they left San Francisco even. But the camera shot what couldn't be seen by the naked eye. Regardless of bandages and unused footage with black GIs, this hospital visit was such a success that the military, a day or so later, suggested that Monroe, who'd be in Japan for a while, hop on a plane for Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and meet some more soldiers. The distance between Tokyo and Seoul is only 1,000 kilometers, and her presence would boost the morale of the 100,000 troops based north of Seoul on the border with North Korea. Not only did Marilyn agree to a 4-day visit, she even agreed to sing. 10 days later, a plane from Tokyo landed at an American air base near Seoul, with Marilyn on board for a visit. She'd already traded in her dress and mink overcoat for far simpler attire, military fatigues. At least 3 cameramen filmed the Korean tour's opening stop. In only days, images of Marilyn in uniform would circle the globe. And from what better event than the Hollywood bombshells visit to GIs in a war-torn country, a country slowly extracting itself from 4 long, cold winters. 14 others made the trip: musicians, singers, an army nurse, a friend, and the organizer of the tour. But we can't see them. They're still inside the plane, waiting for the photographers and the cameramen to finish their session with Monroe before coming out. Another cameraman focuses on the very starched military shirt and Monroe's inimitable touch, lifting the collar and opening the buttons to reveal her cleavage. But time is short. 2 shows are scheduled today at 2 different camps along the border. Surrounded by officers and military police, Monroe is hustled to the helicopter that will bring her to the first camp. You might think she'd come alone, so discreet are the 14 other people and equipment that accompany her, including a piano. Here at the bottom in the striped hat is Jean O'Doul, the friend who accompanied Marilyn, and the wife of DiMaggio's baseball crony Lefty O'Doul, he of the felt hat on the gangway before taking off in San Francisco. Now, Jean had been there too, but the cameras hardly paid attention to her. So what had been announced as a honeymoon was, in fact, 2 men and their wives on a business trip. Several helicopters transported the troop, but the camera only pays attention to the one carrying Marilyn and to the kisses she blows to the crowd. Marines in a camp an hour away are waiting for her. Marilyn Monroe would perform for the Marines from under this covered stage, 3 songs from her 3 most recent films. Problem: with the exception of one public rehearsal with the band in a military hospital in Japan, it would be the first time Marilyn Monroe had ever performed in public, let alone toured. Only her musicians knew and fretted. The Marines had no idea. Time was another problem. Marilyn had agreed to 9 performances in 4 days. Staying on schedule was essential, as was her incessant smile. While the musicians set up, Marilyn poses with Gene O'Doul for the first of a long series of photo shoots. Everything, hairdo, makeup, and smile, are Hollywood perfect. The trick, of course, was to maintain the movie star image for 9 shows in 4 days in the bitter cold at the end of the world. Loudspeakers were installed in the middle of the 10,000 Marines so that those far away could still hear the show. Among the 3 songs she would interpret, one was already well known: "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend." This is the first footage of Marilyn with the orchestra. Let's look more closely. Despite the winter weather, Marilyn's wearing a low-cut summer dress. She seems pretty at ease, but the same can't be said for the singer on the right, nervously waiting for her to signal to the pianist, sitting behind her, to start. This is not an over-rehearsed band, and it shows. Most of the footage shot during the tour was filmed by military cameramen, without sound. Why without sound? Because in 1954, most newsreels were shot without sound. And in any case, what mattered most to the military was great footage of the celebrated Marilyn Monroe visiting American soldiers on the border between North and South Korea. These images were offered free to any television network or cinema company around the world who wanted them. There was, however, one reel shot with sound that day.
Get that ice look out so tight. He's your guy when stocks are high, but beware when they start to descend. It's then that those louses go back to their spouses. Diamonds are a girl's best friend.
Despite her total lack of experience, Marilyn pulled off this first performance, well, like a trooper, with no small touch of audacity. Bravo. But time is short. Look, even as she salutes the soldiers, the musicians are striking the equipment to load it back onto the helicopters to fly to the next gig. The tour organizers have a schedule to maintain. Like others before her, Monroe donated her time to sing for the soldiers. She asked for no amenities of any sort, only the presence of her friend Gene O'Doul. For 4 days in the Korean mountains, she sang the same short program, mingled with similar crowds of soldiers, and posed for the same photos and souvenirs. But by the time she returned to America, Marilyn Monroe's reputation had grown considerably. But for the soldiers here, don't kid yourself, her quick trip through their camp was just one in a string of visits. Exactly 2 winters earlier, in 1952, actress Betty Hutton had come to sing for the soldiers in Korea, showing off, in spite of the freezing temperatures, her celebrated long legs. The war was going on in 1952, and most of the men had their guns with them during the show. Others had been through as well, some less known, like Lita Barron. And as early as 1950, the great Yankee Clipper himself had come to Korea from Japan to support the troops. DiMaggio arrived from Tokyo with Lefty O'Doul, with whom he was already running baseball clinics in Japan. Several days earlier, DiMaggio had been incredibly received in Tokyo, where his exploits as a baseball player were revered, practically as much as in America. In 1950, DiMaggio was 39 and had recently retired from his career as a player. O'Doul convinced him to fill some of his free time by training players and running clinics in Japan. And this is how DiMaggio made his way to visit the troops in Korea while war waged there in 1950. Combat had ended in Korea by February 1954, but the guards that accompanied Marilyn are still armed. Tension is still high on the border between North and South, and between the capitalist and communist worlds. It's a veritable Cold War powder keg. Along 186 miles of the southern border, 18 divisions of American and South Korean troops were stationed, a veritable front line. On the northern border were positioned 7 Chinese Army Corps and 2 North Korean divisions. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, Korea had been separated in two along the 38th parallel, pro-American in the south and pro-Soviet in the north. In 1950, communist forces from North Korea invaded the south, but they were repulsed by American and United Nations troops, who then pushed on north of the 38th parallel, almost to the Chinese border. The Chinese, in turn, launched a vast offensive that progressively returned the border to the 38th parallel. After 3 years of combat in 1953, over 2 million had been killed, injured, or were missing. And it's precisely here where Marilyn is now expected. Monroe is met by the 2-star commander, General McCarr. It's cold at the end of the day at an altitude of over 1,000 meters. And the unheated helicopter explains Gene O'Doul's heavy clothing. What about Marilyn? Marilyn tried to put on a good show, determined to get off that helicopter in her open-collar army fatigue shirt. It was a nice try, but the winter's too cold, and Monroe quickly recuperated her jacket. Everything otherwise resembles the visit to the Marine camp. Marilyn honored General McCarr's request for a photo. The race continues, and the 12,000 soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division are already waiting. They're late. The show wouldn't begin until night had fallen around 6 p.m., when it would be even colder. But Monroe was determined to wear the same dress she had for the Marines earlier in the day. And she did. After the show, Monroe on the 38th parallel and DiMaggio in Tokyo were connected by radio for a brief, much-quoted conversation. "Joe," she said, "you've never seen such crowds." To which the former baseball star apparently replied, "Yes, dear, I have." The next afternoon, Monroe would sing her 4th show on the tour, this time before 14,000 soldiers. No general is here to greet her beforehand, but the welcoming committee invites Monroe to ride through the camp on a Pershing combat tank. An ingenious idea for the cameras, but probably not too comfortable. But the idea of climbing into a tank doesn't seem to faze her. Neither does starting off in the giant Pershing. But was it really like cruising in a comfortable convertible on Sunset Boulevard? The weather turns bad. Rain starts. Rain along the 38th parallel in February is glacial. For the orchestra, it's a catastrophe. The stage is completely uncovered. The question on everybody's mind is whether Marilyn will come out to sing in the freezing rain. Certainly nobody on stage has a clue. The soldiers would be disappointed if the show stopped after they'd waited in the rain. While everyone waits for Marilyn, the singers and musicians do anything they can to entertain the 14,000 troops. The weather gets worse, and the soldiers increasingly impatient to see Marilyn Monroe. When she finally does appear in her low-cut dress, the orchestra is plenty relieved. And just as she... Did you see? Someone thought it best to wipe off the microphone with his hand. Then she signals and begins. 3 songs are planned and 3 are sung. Except that today, the rain and cold drives Marilyn back indoors to dry off and fix her hair between each song. Canceling the show was out of the question. On this afternoon, Marilyn Monroe is singing in the rain. The freezing rain. February 18th. The cameraman's clapboard indicates the date and the location. But Marilyn is spelled wrong. The I after the R is missing. The chances that Monroe noticed this detail are rare. She undoubtedly had other things on her mind. Yesterday, she'd caught a chill in the rain and cold. When we look more closely, the fatigue between poses shows. But for the photographers, the public smile covers the cold inside. This morning she will sing for the 2nd Infantry, who'd lost 7,000 men in the Korean War. For the GIs still stationed along the frozen 38th parallel, the visit must have seemed unreal. Here she was, the Hollywood star whose last 3 films were huge box office hits. Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire. They played her records on the radio. And on top of that, the first issue of Playboy magazine featured naked photos of her. Second clap of the day, with the same spelling mistake. Despite the bitter cold, Marilyn Monroe wears the same summer dress. Let's look again more slowly. While she speaks to the crowd, band members are busy moving the piano closer. Why? So that the pianist can read Monroe's lips. Stage acoustics and band placement make it difficult for him to hear her. So they decide to move up closer and get Marilyn to turn sideways as often as possible so that the pianist can read her lips while she sings. The cold air rushing from her chest and lungs. Third clap. Marilyn's name is finally spelled correctly. Show over. Marilyn has a few free minutes, which the camera captures. What she does is revealing, the camera almost indiscreet. The woman casually bends over to chat with soldiers standing close to the stage. Simply. It's a rare human moment in an otherwise frantic tour that required the star to be on stage at all times. The available footage doesn't reveal whether she did so gracefully or not. 3 days in the faraway mountains in Korea document the cold and accumulated fatigue, but almost as parentheses, because editors generally use the same standard Hollywood image and little else. The next day, return to Seoul and back to Tokyo, where DiMaggio was waiting. But Monroe was suffering from the early stages of pneumonia and would quickly be hospitalized when she got to Tokyo. But while the cameras click away here in Seoul, she continues to pose. The footage and photos of this tour would be seen on television, in movie theaters, and in the press, in America, Europe, and Japan. This is the Paramount newsreel that reported the tour. The title sets the tone.
Marilyn Monroe arrives in Korea to tour the front lines for 4 days. Hubby Joe DiMaggio is in Japan coaching Japanese baseball teams. Marilyn wears drab GI clothing as she meets the boys. No GI ever got such attention. The weather is cold, but nothing distracts from the enthusiasm of the welcome. Now, who'd want an air view at this time? In the natural and chilly outdoor bowl, Marilyn proves she's a real trooper. The hills are alive with troops as Marilyn puts on her act. Officers estimate that she plays to about 60,000 men in her first 2 days in Korea. There's agreement among soldiers and Marines, privates and commanding officers. Marilyn is tops. Says she, "Gosh, I've never seen so many men in my life."
With reports like this and hundreds of photos taken during the tour, the PR machinery churned out the fodder to feed the public and enthroned Marilyn as movie star and sex symbol, exactly the opposite of what Joe DiMaggio had hoped for the trip to Japan. DiMaggio hoped Monroe would abandon a profession for which he had nothing but contempt. That's not how things turned out. Fox had to give in. She started filming with a vengeance as soon as she was well, and she and DiMaggio soon divorced. after only 274 days of marriage. When she died 8 years later, DiMaggio saw to it that fresh roses were laid on her tomb every week, sometimes 3 times a week, and this until the day he died.